Alright, so in the last video we talked about the birth lottery and why we need to account for all of these just sort of opportunities we have in life that are restricted by our luck, right? So if we have good luck at birth, well, then our opportunities could be great and limitless. If we have bad luck at birth, then our opportunities could be dismal. Now, also remember, this is important, that Rawls and everybody else who believes in this birth lottery isn't claiming that no one can get out of the luck of birth, right? Some people might be unlucky, born into the lower class, and then somehow work their way out of it, right? But the major point is that that's not feasible for most people who are born with bad luck or good luck, right? To have mobility one way or the other. And so if you're born with extremely bad luck, there are just so many things stacked against you that your opportunities are dismal comparatively to those born with great luck. Okay, so now that we're past the birth lottery, we need to find out how we should structure our society. And this is where Rawls gets to his idea of the original position. We'll get into what the original position is in a minute, but let's set up the problem first. So the problem is very similar to what we talked about last week with political authority. Right? So in any institution where we're cooperating with one another, some citizens are going to exercise coercive political power over other citizens. Now remember, I said Rawls is a liberal egalitarian, so he thinks in the liberal tradition, everybody is sort of fundamentally equal. So there's this puzzle now. If we have our society set up where some citizens are exercising coercive political power over other citizens, but we're all equal, how can this coercive power be legitimate, right? How can some of us, but not all of us, if we're equal, how can some of us have this ability, this legitimate authority, while some of us are sort of lacking in this type of political power? So what we have to do, according to Rawls, is find principles that all reasonable people would agree to in a completely fair bargaining situation. So what he has in mind here is basically like a democratic assembly of citizens gets together. If you follow the news in the current political climate, there's a lot of talk about town hall meetings. That's sort of what we're picturing here. Right, a bunch of people from the society, everybody ideally, is getting together and trying to see if there are any things they could agree on, right? Even if it's just a basic principle for society, right? But the important thing here is the bargaining situation has to be fair. It can't be influenced by our power or by bias, right? So if this were to happen in the real world, corporate entities could fund some speakers. They could train some speakers to protect and present their viewpoints. Well, the normal person doesn't have the resources to do that, so they would fail sort of in a normal town hall setting. So Rawls is thinking of an ideal situation here where everything, the playing field has been leveled, everything is fair, there's no influence of power, and from there we bargain and try to see if we can find principles that all reasonable people would agree to. Hopefully you see why that would legitimate this coercive political power of some over others. Right? If there are such principles that all reasonable people would agree to, well, then that would legitimize the use of coercive political power because every reasonable person could agree to these terms. Right? So it's saying, hey, you could agree to this, right? Everybody can agree to this? Okay, then we're going to put it into effect. So when the power comes later and we're coercing you to do something, we can say, look, you agreed to these terms at the beginning. This is something that everybody who's reasonable will accept. So what's another way of saying this? Just essentially, if we all agree on some basic rules, then any use of power that stems from those rules that we all agreed on is legitimate. So that's what he's looking to do here. Now, hopefully you're questioning, well, how are we supposed to find a completely fair bargaining situation? Right? Our world is so heavily influenced by bias, power, resources, education, right, that it doesn't seem like many of us, if any of us, are really on a completely fair ground. So how are we supposed to even approximate this idea? And here, Rawls thinks of the veil of ignorance, right? So it's not that Rawls thinks we're actually all going to get together next week in the YMCA building and start figuring all this out, right? He doesn't think it's actually going to happen like that in the real world. What he thinks, though, is we could all put ourselves through the following thought experiment, right? We could think about this just sitting by ourselves, and he thinks we'd all come to the same conclusion. Okay, so remember, we're trying to bargain. Bargain about how to structure our society. And in this bargain, we need to eliminate all influence of power, bias, and so on. Okay, so imagine we're having our imaginary town hall meeting. Rawls thinks it's still good for you to be self-interested, right? He thinks all humans are just sort of fundamentally self-interested. So when you come to the bargaining table, you're still worried about yourself, right? You're still going to try and bargain so that you can secure the best outcome for yourself. So we're all doing that, right? And you know everybody else is doing that. You know everybody's sitting down at the table looking for the best way to advance their own outcomes. However, here's where the veil of ignorance comes in. You're missing a lot of personal information about yourself, right? You don't know your race, you don't know your ethnicity, culture, socioeconomic class, what natural talents you have, what generation you'll be born into, so on and so forth, right? You don't know any of that. Now, why does he need you to be void of such knowledge? Well, he thinks this is how we're really going to get this idea of fairness in the bargaining situation. This is really how we can get rid of power and bias. Right? So if there's this sort of veil that keeps you from knowing what your particular position will be in society. So we go into the original position, which is just imagine your town hall setting, but everybody has a veil dropped in front of them. You can't see. This is a mental veil, right? Not a literal physical veil. It's a mental veil that keeps you from knowing all of these important bits of information about yourself so that you don't know what particular position you're going to end up in society. So what happens is we start with this veil, then we bargain, and we decide on what fair terms would be, and then the veil's lifted, and then we can figure out our position. But at that point, we can't revise anything, right? So if you don't like your position too bad, you already set the terms for all the positions in society, right? So the agreement's already set by the time the veil's lifted, right? So that's why he thinks this is important. We can give this idea of fairness by taking away all of those personal characteristics, because then he thinks we're going to be worried, all of us, every individual at the bargaining table, is going to be worried about what the worst position is. Okay? So given that you don't know which position you'll take and you remain self-interested, what basic principles would you agree to regulate your society? And that's a personal question I'm leaving for you to think about for a while. We'll see what Rawls thinks in the next video. But put yourself in this original position. Try and imagine you don't know like all of the specific personal information about yourself. And then you know you could end up in any random position in society. Rawls thinks it's very likely that you're going to try and pick principles that make sure you're safe no matter what. Right? So what's the worst case scenario? The veil's lifted and you're in the very worst spot you could possibly be in society. Rawls thinks since we're all self-interested, we're all going to make sure that that worst spot is still acceptable. Right? We're not going to pick principles that put the bottom half of society into slavery, because then we have a 50% chance of being born into slavery once the veil is lifted. And so the veil makes us worry about every other spot in society. It takes us out of our own self, takes us out of trying to just advance one position, and because we're self-interested, we want to make sure that any position we might go into isn't terrible. We want to make sure that we're safe from the worst outcomes. Okay, so hopefully you see why this veil rules out most of the power and bias you see in regular bargaining. If I don't know that I'm a white male, then I won't try and advance the positions of white males in society. I'll be worried about every other possible position I could take as well as white male, right? I'll be worried about all of the different groupings of people. That way I can make sure wherever I end up, I'm all right. Okay. And he thinks this will make sure that everybody has a fair say in the outcome. But the important thing is we can all do this mentally, right? We don't have to have an actual town hall. We can all just go through this process on our own and say, hey, okay, I have the veil over me. What would the worst position be? Okay, well, what principles would I agree to given that I could end up in that worst position? So let's look at some examples of not principles that Rawls thinks we would accept. Let's just look at some examples of principles Rawls thinks we clearly wouldn't accept. Right, so given this idea of the original position and the veil of ignorance, here are some principles we would never agree to. Might makes right. We wouldn't agree to a principle like that to rule our society, right? Because we could be born as one of the weaker people in society. Male, female, doesn't matter, right? You could be born with physical disabilities, you could be born with no physical disabilities, but just genetically weak. So you wouldn't want a principle that says might makes right, because there's a very good chance that you could end up without any power in that scenario. Right? You could end up without any might, you could end up without any power, and then you would have sort of, excuse my language, screwed yourself, right? So this is a principle we clearly wouldn't accept from the original position. Let's look at some other examples. Here's a principle we could accept. Only those in the upper class can hold political office. Once again, we would never agree to that in the original position with the veil of ignorance, because that means if we were to accept this principle, there's a very high chance that we would be born into the lower class, and then we would never even have the opportunity to run for political office or wield political power. Right? So we would be almost voiceless in this society, and that's a risk we wouldn't be willing to take. Right? We're self-interested. We don't want to end up powerless, being ruled by the upper class, even if they're good people, which history says the ruling class normally tends to do some bad stuff. Even if the ruling class was good, right, we still wouldn't be willing to accept this principle because it could leave us without any political power. Same with the next principle, only Asian women can be president. Well, clearly we wouldn't accept this because the chances of us being, when the veil is lifted, the chances that we all find ourselves to be Asian women is very small. And we realize that from the original position because we realize the diversity in the world. And so we wouldn't agree to this because then, once again, we could strip ourselves of even the opportunity to ever run for the most important office in the US. And then the final example of a bad principle we wouldn't accept is there can be absolutely no welfare. So why couldn't we accept this principle? And I'm going to leave this last example for the discussion board for you. So here's roughly what I'm thinking. After this video, you should go to the discussion board and answer me. Why can't we accept this last principle? Right? So some might think, well, in the original position, we'd say, yeah, there can't be any welfare because I don't want my property to be taken away from me and given to other people. I have a right to my property. But then put yourself in the worst position in society, as you have to do with the veil of ignorance in the original position, and see, would you accept this principle if there's a chance you could end up in the bottom half or even the bottom 2% of society? All right, and in the next video, we'll look at the two principles that Rawls thinks all of us actually would accept if we were to put ourselves in the original position. And he thinks these are the two principles of justice as fairness. And he thinks we'd all agree to those. But yeah, go to the discussion board now and tell me why we wouldn't accept this final principle if we were in the original position. Thank you.